The 3-week occupation of downtown Ottawa has somewhat dissipated. What began as a trucker convoy against vaccine mandates was co-opted by some extremists, such as the ones waving the Nazi and Confederate flags. They were dubbed a few bad apples among a peaceful protest, which was anything but peaceful. It also shone a light on a troubling aspect of Canada, that extremism is alive and well here. What will it take to stop it? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. The world got a glimpse inside the power of extremism in the case of the January 6th insurrection in the U.S. Capitol. For the residents of downtown Ottawa, the occupation of their area looked eerily similar. Canadians, at least on the world stage, like to promote our tolerance for everyone. But that's an illusion. Hate grows here too. Our Unpublished Vote question asks, do you feel extremism is on the rise in Canada? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote and have your voice heard. Coming up on the Unpublished Cafe, we'll chat with Stephanie Carvin, Associate Professor of International Relations at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. First, I'm pleased to be joined by Barbara Perry, Professor at the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University. And Barbara, is Canada a fertile breeding ground for extremism?
It has certainly become that in the past, let's say 8-10 years, somewhere around there. We started looking very closely at the far right in about 2012, I would say, published our first report in 2015 and identified about 100 active groups at the time, probably a pretty conservative estimate even then. But when Trump burst on the scene, that also seemed to be an impetus for the growth in the movement, both in the U.S. and in Canada as well. It sort of enabled and emboldened those who would share similar sentiments, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant. You name it, you name the community, and he sort of attacked them. And so it did spread up here as well. And we had a number of other factors playing into that. And COVID has, put another log on the fire, if you will. We started with a lot of anti-Asian and anti-Semitic sentiment, and that has been taken on board very much by the far right. And then with the restrictions and the mandates, that gave them yet another lightning rod on which to rally the troops.
Some words that came out during the occupation here in Ottawa, we hear about, obviously, extremism. We heard a lot about populism as well. Are they the same? Are they similar? Or how would you describe the difference?
Yeah, they're related. They're very closely akin. I think that, when we talk about extremism, it is what it says on the tin, right? It is the extreme, it is the fringe, it is the most provocative, I guess, illustration or expression of concerns. Populism revolves more around sort of exploitation of popular grievances, a hostility towards the elite, a hostility even towards political correctness as well in the contemporary current. So the relationship there then is that the far right is very good at exploiting, much better than the left, very good at exploiting, masterful, in fact, at exploiting those sorts of popular grievances and concerns. So in this case, we're seeing, rallying around this notion of a tyrannical state or a state that's overreached its powers and is, threatening freedoms and threatening liberty. So that, I think, is where the far right and populism come together in this particular moment.
Do you feel from what you saw over the 3 weeks at Ottawa that there were extremist elements here in the occupation?
Oh, there absolutely were. And it's no surprise if you look at the organizers, who, by the way, had no relationship to the trucking industry, very closely connected to the energy sector and the oil industry. But they themselves had long and deep roots with the far right movement, much of it originating with the earlier Yellow Vest movement. You'll remember, 4 years ago, and the Unite and We Roll rally, which we saw the similar sort of co-optation by the right of, a set of popular and legitimate and authentic concerns around threats to the energy sector in the West in particular. So when you have, leaders with with that kind of agenda and ideology, then it's going to be appealing. So as it moved its way across the country, that slow-moving snowball, it did pick up. It picked up a lot of people with very authentic concerns about mandates and about their own health, but it also picked up an awful lot of other actors and ideologues from the far right. So that, we see obviously Diagolon in there. We see Soldiers of Odin, Three Percenters, Infidel. So, a number of groups came to the movement, but also just individuals. I mean, the movement has become much more atomized in recent years. So we saw a lot of individuals with views that are very sympathetic to the far right, and were expressing. We saw some expressions of racism, obviously, but here what really came to the fore were the anti-statist and anti-authority elements of the far right, unlike anything we've seen in recent years.
We talk about extremism, and far right is something we've, spoken about quite a bit here. But, what about far left extremism? What's the difference between the two?
Well, I think when we look at the far left, and I think we've done a couple of webinars ourselves looking at exactly this question. When we're talking about the far left, and especially the Antifa that the far right likes to pillory, and that many media like to focus on, think about what it stands for. That is the anti-fascist. They exist only to challenge racist, fascist organizations, whereas the far left, as we know it today, I mean, if we look at the MOU associated with the convoy, for example, it stated explicitly that one of their goals was to overturn a democratically elected government. So the far right is anti-democratic and anti-statist, as it is today. It's racist. It's often homophobic. It's often anti-feminist and misogynistic. So it is, it is obviously on the other extreme. It opposes social justice initiatives, and it's reactionary and conservative, as opposed to the far left and Antifa in particular, which I think proudly would claim the label social justice warriors that's used as an insult often by the far right and conservatives.
You mentioned your 2015 report on extremism, and it notes one of the key issues is weak police enforcement. Now, after what we saw for 3 weeks in Ottawa, how much do you think that was in play during the Ottawa occupation? Because people in this town were so upset to see the police hobnobbing with the demonstrators, if they call themselves that, and nothing was happening for the residents.
Yeah. And I think there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the way that was managed. And it was interesting to me because early on, before the convoy even left BC, slowly was saying, we know they're coming. We anticipate violence. We have to be prepared for that. So they sounded prepared, but certainly didn't behave as if they were prepared. So didn't cordon off the downtown so that they couldn't make it, to the Parliament buildings, for example. You would have thought we'd learn something from January 6th, for example. Now, that said, Toronto did learn something because they did cordon off the downtown on the weekends when protests were planned. But, aside from the lack of preparedness and the lack of resources, I think we also do see some sympathy on the part of law enforcement for these sorts of movements. There's a lot of parallels there in terms of, their position on some of the same issues, including mandates. We have, Mounties for Freedom, the Facebook page, for example. And so there is resistance among some elements of law enforcement to that. And we saw that, right? The one officer who was heard on video, seen on video, saying, I support you 100%. The other one, the OPP officer who was using his cruiser for a photo booth, if you will. So, there was that sympathy there. And I think that we're hearing that, that disparity and that those complaints about disparity, especially from Indigenous and Black communities where, they've had smaller and short-lived demonstrations that have been met with far more force than what we saw here. So I think it was quite clear.
So in terms of extremism, how does Canada confront that?
Well, I often say that, it's not just a regulatory issue. It's not just a law enforcement issue, but in fact, it is a multi-sectoral approach that's needed here. Education, public health, the media have a role to play here as well. So not just government, but civil society and the private sector as well. Obviously, social media companies have a lot to answer for here. But I think one of the things that has enabled and allowed recruitment to the movement has been, I think, a lack of digital literacy, critical digital literacy, and our capacity to sift out the misinformation, disinformation from facts, if you will. And of course, that's the point of debate, isn't it? Which facts are real facts? But I think that we do need more, not just for youth, but for adults as well. I mean, adults have been very much swept up in the conspiracy theories and disinformation as well. So how do we help people to build the resiliency, the capacity to resist, to challenge, to be much more reflective about the sorts of things that are crossing their screens? And I think that that's one area we certainly need to do a lot of work. But we obviously also need much more leadership at the political level. I think that there was no party that spoke forcefully enough, I think, or has even spoken forcefully over the last 6 or 8 years as we've seen this dramatic growth. And in fact, quite the opposite, where we've seen political parties pander to the movement, whether it's the convoys right now, as we've seen them, or their predecessors over the past couple of years.
Barbara, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.
Barbara Perry's professor in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University. What many people in Ottawa were shocked about was the absolute lack of enforcement by police and the organization of the convoy. Stephanie Carvin is Associate Professor of International Affairs at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, and she joins us now. And Stephanie, it seemed police had no plan to deal with this, which, as an Ottawa resident myself, I find quite incredulous, considering, the movement made no qualms saying it was coming to Ottawa. Police in Ottawa are on the front lines, in particular when we have dignitaries coming through. And I remember when George Bush came here back in, it had to be 10, 12 years ago, the choppers were in the air. Everything was shut down for that visit. But, we knew for weeks, if not months, that this was coming here and nothing was done.
Yeah, it is mind-boggling. I mean, I think, we Ottawa residents, have memories of just some really ridiculous things, like a lemonade stand being shut down with the full enforcement of the National Capital Commission. I think was it last summer or 2 summers ago, there was a Shakespearean production in a backyard that was shut down because it was causing a disturbance. And yet we don't see anything in this particular case. Now, I think part of the reason for that is, like, let's be generous in some ways. So Ottawa is, of course, a city of different levels of responsibility, right? There you have the municipal level, you then have the NCC, which is the National Capital Commission, which is, recognizes that both parts of Ottawa and Gatineau are part of kind of the federal, important to the federal landscape and nationally important. So they have a say in things. And then the Rcmp also has a role, right? They, like, specifically for, you mentioned George W. Bush, when a dignitary like that comes to town, or there's a special protected person, that responsibility is not of the Ottawa Police, it's actually the Rcmp. So I think that actually helps explain some of the confusion. Like, I'm not sure that people really understood where the responsibility lied. And then because of that, because this was such an intractable situation, I think there was a lot of effort quite quickly to try and kick responsibility to a different level in something I'm calling jurisdictional hot potato. So I think this is what it kind of came down to, is that pretty much by, day leading up to this, we see Ottawa Police literally with welcome signs. And they had a picture with a truck saying, "Hey, welcome to Ottawa. It's your right to peacefully protest. Go for it." And then after this, there were, 3 days later, we see calls for federal help because this is now somehow a foreign funded and controlled protests, according to the person who's chief of police at the time, Chief Slowly. So they started then asking for federal responsibility, and then and where's the province in this? I have no idea. So I mean, I think this kind of problem of maybe it's a typical Ottawa thing, and I think I'm definitely now speaking outside my expertise, but you have a situation where no one really wanted to take responsibility, and the easiest thing to do in Ottawa is just kick it to a different level of government.
Now, going back to the Bush thing for a second, I was down there when they were rolling in. Now, the Rcmp could be in charge, but Ottawa police officers were everywhere, in support of that. But this trucker convoy, how do you think the extremists were able to join in? Or do you think maybe they started it and the convoy against mandates decided to jump on board?
So what this really was is a movement that was at its heart organized by extremists, right? This is a group of people who have tried to organize multiple convoys over time. They did so in 2019, much less successful at that time. And they tried to, frame their grievances around oil and gas, right? That was supposed to be about oil and gas. In reality, it was kind of really about a conspiracy theory that the United Nations is somehow trying to engage in white genocide by by bringing over Muslim refugees to Canada, right? But you can't really sell a mass movement on that kind of idea. You can sell them on maybe oil and gas, but where it really worked is when they framed their grievances not around oil and gas or conspiracy theory, but around pandemic exhaustion, right? So at its heart, there were extremists. I mean, if you look at the views of Tara Lick, who's now been denied bail and is in prison. I mean, she was the head of she was really with those convoys in 2019, and she heads up the Maverick Party, which wants to have Western separation. You have BJ Deichter, who's made a very Islamophobic remarks and has accused Canadian politics of basically being infiltrated by, basically Muslim extremists. You have Pat King, who, well, as of this recording, I don't think really we know what his status is, I'll also say. But yeah, we have him, and he's, talked about solving problems with bullets. He's talked about white genocide. So these are the kind of views of the people who literally organized this. So you have an extremist-led event, which unsurprisingly turns to extremist tactics. And then on top of that, what ends up happening is you have different extremist groups that then look for these opportunities in order to create chaos. The way I've been explaining it is they're not as much interested in mandates as they are in mayhem, right? They want to take advantage of any opportunity to further recruit, right? So by going through the masses and trying to bring people in. Secondly, trying to create chaos, the perception that, government's faltering, collapsing, these kinds of things. And quite frankly, a lot of them just enjoy torturing people. If we can take a city hostage and laugh at the people who are suffering as a result, then that's something that appeals. So you then have various groups, Canada First, Diagolon. These were groups that jumped in. I think Diagolon's probably more prominent at this time, possibly because of the involvement of someone who was considered to be their head of security, Chris Lysyk, out in Calgary, and who's arrested now for apparently plotting or allegedly plotting to kill Rcmp officers. So I think that this is the deal. You have people in an extremist movement which is able to tap into a much wider set of grievances, right? That everyone in society can recognize. I mean, I'm tired of this pandemic. I'm tired of lockdowns, all these, it's not inaccessible. But then on top of that, when you have this kind of chaotic situation, that attracts further people who are going to want to take advantage of this for their own benefit.
What do extremists get out of the chaos, the mayhem, destabilizing society?
So there are groups. So Diagolon in particular is usually referred to as a neo-fascist accelerationist network. That's the language of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. That's how they describe them. So neo-fascist in the idea that, okay, these are people who don't believe in democracy. They believe Canada's corrupt. It's ultimately going to fail, that people are not being well served by a particular elite, right? And that they are kind of at the vanguard of wanting to push forward the inevitable collapse of society, right? They don't think, the point about accelerationists is there's all different kinds of accelerationists. But in this particular case, you have individuals who believe that, society is corrupt, it's ultimately going to fail, and they should work to push that failure faster, because out of that failure will come, in their view, a white ethno state that they can live in. That's literally where the name Diagolon comes from, right? It comes from this idea that they're going to be able to carve out through a diagonal line a chunk of North America where they can live as they will. But that'll only happen if there is some kind of chaotic collapse through which this ridiculous idea of a state can be born.
How much do these people need the acceptance of their beliefs?
So I think, it really depends. I mean, we have here, and I've been thinking about this question a lot. It's interesting that you asked this, because I'm thinking, there's really just a fraction of people who are willing to sit in their cars or trucks for 3 weeks and give up everything in order to force change, to block a bridge, all these different kinds of things. It's only a fraction, but that fraction caused a lot of chaos. Hundreds of millions of dollars of chaos has been hit against this country as it tries to get out of this pandemic. And you really have to think, well, geez, maybe, how much of our security is really based on the idea that, like, the vast, vast, vast majority of people believe in the system, right? So does it actually take a lot for things to, and not even necessarily violent tactics in the way that we would traditionally conceive of violent tactics. Like normally when you think of violent tactics and extremist movements, you think of unfortunately, of shootings, explosions, and things like this. But in this case, yeah, I mean, the movement was portraying itself as nonviolent. Now, that wasn't true, because, if you torture people for 3 weeks straight by not letting them sleep because of honking, if you're harassing them, if you're targeting homeless shelters, or if you're targeting the kinds of things that people need to live their everyday lives. Or a good example, there were bomb threats against hospitals. There were floods to the 911 system. This is not the hallmarks of a nonviolent movement. And it was enough to cause a lot of chaos. So I think there's a lot of questions being asked right now within the various national security agencies themselves, thinking, okay, well, do we need to rethink our idea of what extremism is, of what political violence is? But in doing so, does that then just open Pandora's box to other, criminalizing other kinds of protests, which can often be disruptive as well? So it's a lot of good questions here. And I'm not sure I have great answers.
How much does social media amplify their movement and their message?
Huge. I mean, I don't think it should be underplayed at all. It's really, the social media does a number of things. At the very least, it provides a sense of connectivity, right? That these people don't feel alone. Whereas at one time it'd be very hard for these individuals to connect with one another. This social media platforms absolutely allow them to form these kinds of, I think the term bubble is overused, but certainly a polarized group. Right. And a group that isn't just polarized, but polarizing further, like more and more extreme over time. And I think that's a real issue. The other thing it did was it provided the Canadians in this movement a sense that they were at the vanguard of an international resistance to pandemic measures, including vaccines. That, Canada's boring. For these individuals to suddenly feel like they're at the forefront of something, changing history. I mean, that has to be a really kind of powerful drug to have. And then the third thing was just kind of the material support, right? There was a lot of ways that social media was involved in getting this movement going. The way that Telegram channels, Facebook, Twitter were all promoting the different crowdfunding platforms. We wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation if it wasn't for social media, because there's no way they would have raised $10 million. And the fact that they raised $10 million in and of itself is not just, materially significant, but it became a symbol in and of itself. And so, I think that this is, it's really hard to downplay the impact of social media on all of this, particularly at a time when, in Canada, we're thinking about how to deal with this idea of online harms.
Stephanie, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you. This is cathartic. I feel better. Thank you.
Stephanie Carvin's Associate Professor of International Relations at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Our Unpublished Vote question asks, do you feel extremism is on the rise in Canada? yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote. I want to thank our guest today, Barbara Perry, professor in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University, and Stephanie Carvin of Carleton University. And I want to thank you for watching the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.